we pitched them, they understood the problem, they thought we had a neat solution, a different solution, and I guess we showed them the proof of concept, which was a benchtop experiment. But I mean, how are they gonna know, right? They said, hey, we think it's a good idea. How about we introduce you to a few people that are in a better position to judge? So they introduced us to 3 of the biggest names in self-driving around the world, people that were intimately involved in developing self-driving cars and that intimately knew, or especially knew, around the LiDAR problem for self-driving. So they made the introductions. We had to kind of tell these teams our idea, and then on the back of it, these teams reported back to Blackbird saying, well, what they thought about the idea, right? And I don't know exactly what they said. It must have been something like, look, it looks very different, a bit crazy, but if they can do it, it sounds like an amazing idea.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 146 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Rohit, Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to have Federico Collarte, the co-founder and CEO of Baraja, as my guest for this episode. Baraja are the creators of the Spectrum Scan LiDAR technology, which simply put, enables autonomous vehicles to see the road via lasers. Their pioneering technology completely rethinks environment scanning for autonomous vehicles. They do this by exploiting the wavelength properties of light to see lasers through prisms in order to better detect objects at range. To date, Baraja has raised $63.9 million in funding, led by funds such as Blackbird and Main Sequence Ventures. In this interview, we covered a wide range of topics, including the importance of being contrarian and right, balancing long-term vision with short-term execution, the challenges and opportunities that come from building a market from scratch, how Baraja was able to raise funding for a deep tech project at a very early prototype stage, and much more. Without further ado, here is my interview with Federico Collarte. Hi, Fed. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Hi, Rohit. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be talking to you today.
Likewise, I have followed your journey extensively over the last few years, so very, very excited to have you on the show. But Fed, for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Right. So, hi everyone. My name is Federico Collarte. I'm the founder and CEO of Baraja. Baraja is a company based in, headquarters here in Sydney, Australia, with offices in the United States, Europe, and Asia. We do LiDAR for automotive self-driving applications. LiDAR is the laser eyes for the self-driving cars. And beyond self-driving cars, any robotics application that requires extremely good sensing, 3D sensing around the robot. So we think that we will be the eyes of the robotics revolution that is starting now.
Absolutely. And such a fascinating story as well. Obviously, you've just raised $40 million as well. So very keen to kind of talk about your journey, but I just wanted to go back to the very beginning. Obviously, you and Sibi have built this incredible company building, as you mentioned, the future of autonomous vehicles and building the infrastructure that goes into that. But what were the early days like? From my conversation with Sibi, I think he mentioned that you first spoke about it when you were both working together, but you spoke about the idea of the business or kind of the future of the space over some beer at the pub?
Yeah, that's right. So I guess from an early age, I liked building things, and I thought of myself as wanting to be an inventor. So when I went to university, and then the works that I sought were around product development, R&D, where I could get experience in building and designing products. I met my co-founder, Sibi, who's my co-founder and CTO. We met at a company in Australia, in Sydney, developing components and subsystems for optical telecommunications. Basically, the stuff that powers the internet, right? The long-haul networks over fiber optic, the lasers, the receivers, everything that goes at either end of an optical telecommunications network. And I guess, having water cooler conversations, I knew that he also had a niche to eventually start his own company or to do something, to invent, to have that part of a journey. I guess, look, it was nothing more than just a conversation for a long time until probably 2015. I'm hard to remember. Yeah, 2015, where the self-driving car revolution started to become more mainstream. You started hearing a lot more about it on the news. So I started looking into it, and I started understanding that one of the key enablers of self-driving cars is, well, good sensing of the environment around them. And the key sensor, the crown jewel of sensing, is in this case a 3D sensor, a sensor that has high resolution, that can see day and night, but that not only sees, but also measures the distance to every object around the car. And that sensor is called LiDAR, light detection and ranging. It's very similar to a radar, but it uses laser light to shoot beams. And then once that laser light goes into the environment, hits an object, and there's an echo, a reflection coming back, you can calculate that there's an object there. And you can also calculate, due to the round trip time, how far away that object is. So it is the crown jewel of sensing, because it sees day and night, it's high resolution, and because it accurately and directly measures distance to every object. So a car can understand not only what's around it, but where in space it is. Going back to where I met my co-founder, for the first time, I think we found an idea that was interesting, technically interesting. I mean, remember, we were technical people, we are technical people. The idea had to appeal to us from a technical point of view, but also it had huge market potential. You know, if we solve this, we are enabling the mass adoption in autonomous and beyond autonomous vehicles, robotics. And it also had the other aspect of what we were seeking in an idea, which was we wanted an idea for a product that would be visible, something that you could point, you know, you, me, my kids could point and say, hey, that was invented by me. So in this case, hey, that car has the eyes that Baraja developed, which is different from the company we used to work for optical telecommunications. Literally, we were powering the internet, but you could never point to where the internet is. So that part wasn't as satisfying as seeing or building a product that can make an impact on everyday life, that is tangible, that you can say, hey, that car has Baraja eyesight. So I think for the first time we found an idea we fell in love with, technically, commercially, and also from a impact point of view. I started doing a bit of research on, well, what would it take to do this? What are the competitors? How much do they sell for? What are their specifications? What are the customers? How big is the market? And that process, you know, just every night after work, looking at news, doing a bit of research, how many cars are sold per year in America and around the world, and this and that. Eventually, I guess I built a model in a spreadsheet, and also a model in my head that said, hey, I think we can do it. I think we can do it cheaper, much better than any competitor. And I think I'm gonna love doing this. So when I had this, I realized, look, I am an electronics engineer by education. I worked most of my life as a systems engineer, but I needed someone more technical or more deeply technical than myself. And my co-founder, Sivi, he's got a PhD in photonics, and he understood a lot more the other photonic optics are more mechanical and systems. So when eventually, I guess we synchronized and we said, yeah, this is something that we're both passionate about. We quit our jobs and we started Baraja. And I guess that's the genesis. Do you want me to continue with that line of the story?
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, you know, I think it's always fascinating to hear about the process that happens before the start of the business. Obviously, you know, I think for a lot of people on the outside, it can seem like you just come up with the idea and next day you've got funding and all of those sort of things. And I think it's really important to talk about that sort of 6 to 9 month process that you went through to really sort of understand the market.
It is 6 to 9 months, actually, or even longer, I guess. Well, so the first time I talked to CB, he said, no, sounds good, but no, I've just had another baby and I cannot do it. And then, but he said, but you should talk to my friend who would definitely be the right person. I talked to a few other people. Eventually, they were not the right person, or they were not at the right time. And then I had already told my wife, I had told my father-in-law. They were at a point where they said, hey, you have to do it, otherwise you're not going to forgive yourself for not doing it. So then I tried again, and I talked to CB again, and I said, hey, are you sure you don't want to do it? I said, you know what? The time is right, let's do it. But by then my wife was pregnant. And she said, you know what, let's do it, but let's wait until our first son is born and check that everything is okay. So we delayed it a little bit, and my first son was born on July 25th, which is also Siri's birthday. And then after that, we went and we quit and we started the company. Again, look, that also looks very linear, right? But I'm shortening it. Along the way, we had talked to a few friends and family and said, hey, look, we have this idea. Knowing you, I know that this is something that you might be interested, or you've said in the past you like startups. Would you like to back us? And we felt the idea required some de-risking initially, both on the technical side. Also, we wanted to spend some time lodging a patent and doing a proof of concept. So we raised from friends, family, 10 friends, $10,000 each, so 100K. And we were prepared, C and I, to live off our savings for up to 9 months, I think. Back then, we thought it was going to last 9 months. So we spent 100K buying, well, I think it was 15K that we spent in patents. And then we bought some equipment that was actually quite expensive, a laser that was about $50,000, and some data acquisition cards, etc. Why we felt we needed to do all of this before going into a VC round or anything like that is because the technical risk and the commercial risk were extremely high. So we did this on a convertible note with friends and family, I guess. But also because, let me tell you a bit about the technology. Baraja has invented a new type of LiDAR. So we're doing LiDAR, but we're doing it in a way that no one else is doing it in the world. We are the inventors of Spectrum Scan. Basically, we took a laser from optical telecommunications, and this laser is able to change color. What we invented was the way to get it to change color millions of times per second, repeatably, accurately, time and time again, over time, vibration, shock, all of the environmental conditions you would encounter on a car. And then this laser that is fiber coupled, we decided to take the light out of the fiber and shoot it through prism-like optics. And when light that changes color goes through a prism, the prism acts as an optical router, moving the light on different angles depending on the color. That's how we get the laser to scan the environment, but without moving parts. Whereas every one of our competitors has a moving part, has something that steers the laser beam. So the key innovation is we took a laser from a different industry and applied it to a new industry, and we removed the steering mechanism. For us, the steering mechanism is the color of the light itself. Why removing a mechanism or a component is important? Because if you remove something, you are removing a failure mode. Therefore, you're increasing the reliability of the system. If you're removing a component, it means you can shrink the system. And if you're removing a component, it means you can cost it down because you've removed that cost. So those are three very good attributes for automotive, which is high volume, low cost, high reliability. So anyway, the idea sounded really simple, right? It's high school physics, changing color of light, prisms, but it sounded in a way too good to be true, too simple to be true. So we actually thought it's probably a terrible idea. Either it doesn't work, and we're the only ones in the world that don't know that it doesn't work, and maybe everybody else already figured out that it doesn't work, or maybe it does work, but someone else has the patent. So that's why we went through that phase of doing a proof of concept. At the end, hey, it does work, and lodging the seminal patents of a Spectrum Scan that are now the core of what we've done in a very, very different way than anyone else in the world, even today.
I was about to say, like, it's, especially when you're essentially building an industry or building a market from scratch, and you don't necessarily have a playbook to follow. And as you mentioned, you're sort of putting your hat in the ring or putting all of your eggs on the basket of one technology when everyone else seems to be doing it the other way. I'm sure that there are sort of moments of doubt and things like that creep in. I think Sibi mentioned that you had spoken to the ex-CEO for automotive company from memory, and he said this is never going to work. And I'm sure you had sort of multiple conversations like that. As I guess the founder of the business, how do you kind of retain that conviction for yourself, but also for, extend that out to your team, especially when there are moments when, things maybe aren't working out or things aren't necessarily going to plan?
I guess that's a really good question. I guess it comes down to the individual. There's a few people, and I think I'm one of them, that has a very strong inner compass. I think I adjust my compass by talking and meeting and absorbing new information, but eventually the decision always comes from within, right? The second part, I guess, is when you think about something so deeply that you feel you've seen the next problem and then the next problem. And I always felt that we at Baraja were designing a LiDAR not for the R&D fleets of autonomous vehicles that were using LiDARs back then, but we were trying to design a LiDAR for the ultimate application, what we call the end game LiDAR, right? Something that can go all the way to high volume, all the way to low cost, all the way to high reliability. And we deliberately constrained ourselves back at the beginning of the company to design choices that were only gonna be scalable long term. That made it a little bit more difficult, I guess, but it ensured we were gonna have a product roadmap that we could articulate from beginning to end. Look, that doesn't make it any easy, right? Like there's a lot of people that say no, and that's never gonna work, and etc. So that's where the self-belief comes in. But it's not blind self-belief, right? Is you've thought about, in this case, the engineering problem and the physics of light so deeply that you think, hey, this problem is not just going to be a problem for me. This is going to be a problem for them, and they are not going to be able to solve it, and I will, right? Fundamentally, the laws of physics apply to everyone. So I guess the confidence comes from an understanding that, yes, there are problems, but for me, it's going to be easier to solve that problem than if I were to do it in the way the other person is doing it, even if today it's faster for them to get to an initial product, right? Eventually, they're going to hit a wall and they're going to have to pivot the technology, whereas our technology is coherent from beginning to end. All the way to when we go into high volume automotive production, we're going to be using Spectrum Scan as the primary technology. This laser that changes color millions of times per second, and then the prism-like optics that steer the light. And there's lots of other innovations like that go with us. And the last part is think about the reward, right? If you are right, if you have a good idea, which is the right idea, but it's also consensus. So everybody else thinks that is the right way and the right idea, then everyone else is doing it. So then the reward is very small. So in a startup, I think the key is to be right and contrarian, not consensus. And that is always a challenge, but that's the big reward, because if you're right and you're the only one that is right, the reward is massive. And that's I think, even today, the position in which Baraja is, where we are still the contrarian that can see all the way into the future, into an end game LiDAR.
Absolutely. And, you touched on this earlier, but I guess one of the important parts of being a contrarian, right, is having someone or finding those early believers. And, I think one of the people or the funds that were the first to sort of believe you were Rick Baker from Blackbird, who I spoke to as well, who mentioned when he first met you was at a startup event when you came up to him and said, I've got a company that's working in LiDAR or building LiDAR technology. What did that process look like? Especially in Australia, I know that things have sort of started to change, especially over the last few years, but I imagine sort of 5 to 6 years ago, the landscape was very different and there wasn't a huge amount of investment that was going into the space, especially in deep tech into the space. What did that look like, especially for a product that was very much a prototype stage at that time to try and convince a fund like Blackbird to jump in and back you at that stage?
Yeah. Look, it's not rocket science. It's people, right? You need to talk to people and you need to convince people. And so I not only did I meet Rick, I made the effort and I went to different events. So the first thing is look at the portfolio of companies' offices, right? I guess you can get money out of anyone, but it's easier if you talk to someone that understands the problem you're trying to solve. So I knew that Blackbird had invested in a self-driving car company called Zoox. So I thought they probably have heard of LiDAR and why LiDAR is a big problem that needs to be solved. And that I was right. And then the second part is most VCs make an effort to be available, to be at events where they speak, and there's usually drinks after and stuff like that. So I tried to go to these events, and I went to one event where I met Rick. He was giving a talk, and then after that, there was a drink, and I introduced myself. I said, when you feel ready, come talk to me. And then I went to a different event where Nikki Shevak was talking, and I introduced myself. I also met Sam Wong. Back then, also, Bill Barty was one of the partners. I went to another event where Bill was there, and I met them, and I felt I really like these people. So I said, hey, I'm going to come and reach out again when I have the proof of concept working on the patents. And when I did, I guess it wasn't a cold introduction, right? They already knew me. I had already told them what I was working on, and that once I had a proof of concept and a patent, I was going to come talk to them. So that gives them at least 2 points in time and with different, so at different times and with different levels of progress, and then they can calibrate on you as an individual with an ability to deliver on an idea, right? Hey, yes, there has been, say, 3 months and this much level of progress. Okay, I can then try to extrapolate, I guess. Yeah, so that's how I did it. It's not that hard in the sense that the VCs do make themselves available, and I guess my biggest takeaway is talk to people that understand the problem so that they can appreciate your solution. The last lesson I learned, and that's true even today, is people love demos, right? So it is actually really hard to raise money virtually on COVID for a hardware type startup. Every time that I've been successful fundraising, it's been where people have experienced my product and what it can do, right? So we go on a van, we drive around, they get to experience the LiDAR point cloud that our product produces. They get to see our engineering teams, our pilot manufacturing. They fall in love with these things. It is very human in that way.
Speaking of humans and people, obviously funding is one component of building a great business. The real engine is having the right people around you to help build a product and take it to market. Again, one of the people that I got to speak to in the lead up to this interview was Duncan Ross, who is your very first hire in the company and continues to work at the company 5 years later. Especially considering the industry and the vertical that you're in, building a new product in a new market, I imagine that there isn't a whole heap of talent that's sitting around that has, years or decades of experience in this technology. Really curious to understand, what does that process look like for you, and how does Baraja look at its hiring process to ensure that you're hiring the right people, but also training them to build the future that you're trying to build?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, we knew hiring was going to be tough. Everybody told us. It's tougher than anyone tells you, and it's tougher than you imagine it was going to be. But I guess at least we came with the expectation it was going to be difficult, and we came with a few good ideas, I think, that we didn't invent, but we saw and we copied and we borrowed and stole from other places. So I used to work at Cochlear, and I remember from my time in Cochlear, I wasn't a graduate engineer, but I remember they had a really good graduate engineering program where they got bright young engineers and they would get them to do a rotation around different areas, firmware, software, mechanical systems. And then not only did they at the end get to choose the best graduate engineers, but these graduate engineers had a superpower, which was they understood not just one discipline, they understood lots of disciplines, lots of aspects of the product. And even more importantly, they knew a lot of people around the business, because when you're solving problems, sometimes is about who do you ask. And we copied and we borrowed and we stole that from day one. I think our employee number 5, I think, is the first graduate engineer we hired, and we got him to do 3 months of building the product, 3 months of mechanical design, then 3 or 6 months of systems engineering. Then he traveled with me to do customer demos and installations and troubleshooting. So all of a sudden you have a guy, I don't know, a year after uni, that knows how to build, how to design, how to install, how to talk to customers, how to troubleshoot in front of a customer, right? Where you don't know if you're gonna faint or have a heart attack, right? And you're solving the problem in the middle of the demo, with your moment where everything's supposed to go well, everything turns sour, and still manage expectations and carry that through. So these early investments into the graduate engineering program have paid off massively. Some of our brightest and most talented people at Baraja came through the graduate engineering program. Some of these guys are now product managers, squad leads, or equivalent of an engineering lead. Extremely young, but I don't think I could hire anyone anywhere in the world that could come and perform at the level that they are performing today, because they intimately know everything about the product. They know everyone in the company. They know how to talk to customers, how to build it and stuff like that. It is a big investment, but it is really rewarding. On the other side, to be able to be successful here, you need to have some senior people that can bring these junior people up. And that is extremely challenging. And that is more and more difficult to hire here in Australia around several disciplines. One of them is manufacturing. Australia has kind of forgotten how to manufacture, and especially high-tech manufacturing. There's very little high-tech manufacturing happening in Australia. You can probably count it with 1 or 2 hands. Companies that can do manufacturing of a product that builds electronics, software, optics, photonics, mechanical, with reliability considerations, thermal considerations, cost down considerations. It's almost a lost art. So we've had to import a few people from overseas to help us with manufacturing of the more specialist areas around photonics and optics. And we also have a team in the US that is growing, right?
Yeah, I guess, you've kind of touched on some of the sort of hiring pros and cons. I know Sibi mentioned that you wanted to move to the coast for a while for the business. You wanted to move the business closer to the beach, which I think he put a sort of hard stuff on. But aside from that, I think it's really interesting that you sort of made the decision to stay in Australia versus, I assume where you would have access to more resources or people, elsewhere in the world. From your perspective, what are some of the pros and cons of building and kind of retaining the headquarters and the majority of your sort of production here locally?
Yep. So let's start with the pros, or the imperatives, I guess. Why we had to, first of all, this is possible because Australia has good universities, right? If you didn't have good raw material, you cannot create this graduate program. And that we have really good universities, technical universities. The second part is that, yes, going somewhere else, maybe you can get more already trained talent, kind of ready to use, like for example, Silicon Valley, but the cost per engineer is a lot higher, and I don't want to call it loyalty, but the tenure of professionals is a lot shorter, right? So yeah, you on the one hand, you get people that are ready to use, but they usually don't last very long in your company. Whereas I don't actually have the number off the top of my head, but employee number 1 still works here, and so do a lot of the early employees, a lot of them. The second part is we knew we were developing breakthrough technology, new to world, right? Spectrum Scan is new to world. And we knew that when you're inventing something so radical, in a way, you have to go the extra mile and also invent how to manufacture it. So we've actually built a fantastic team, not only to design and the product, but we've got a great R&D team that has designed the manufacturing, the testing, the calibration, and the automation to make a Spectrum Scan in a way that it can be scalable into large volumes, right? And there's a lot of intellectual property in that as well. So the imperative was, hey, we need to have physical closeness between the designers of the product and the designers of the manufacturing, the people that will design how to put it together. And that's why we chose to be all here. And it's only a bit later that now we've started expanding, well, the US, East Coast, West Coast, as well as Europe, China, et cetera, et cetera. But that's at least how it started. Then, yeah, and then what are the cons? The cons are that here in Australia, you can find really great people and great professionals, but it is almost impossible, I would say impossible, to find a great person and professional who has a career record or a career history that makes that person well suited for what we are doing. In many cases, I find a good professional, and my question when I'm interviewing or hiring is always, can this person read across, jump across one industry and transfer what he learned in that other industry and apply it into what we are doing? And in many cases, yes, you can, but wouldn't it be a lot easier if I could just say, hey, this person has already worked in hardware, high-tech manufacturing with optics, with photonics, with electronics, and that people you cannot find here, not many people at least, and you can find plenty in other parts of the world. So it is, yeah, it's not just a great person and a great professional, but it looks like since that person was born, he had been training to join my company. And that's the kind of talent you find in the States. It looks like, wow, his mother was preparing him to join my company or something like that, right?
Yeah, just on that as well, because, as you mentioned, and the amount that you invest in people as well is quite a substantial investment from a business perspective as well. What are kind of specific qualities that you're looking for, and how do you go about testing that through the hiring process?
Well, for young people, we look at people that really like what they're studying. So I'm talking about graduates, right? Hey, let's say you are a electronics engineer. Well, just the fact that you went to uni to study electronics doesn't really mean that you love electronics. The love comes when you go as far as having extracurricular activities where you get to use your skills, right? And so we test a lot for people that have joined clubs, robotic clubs, or solar electric vehicle clubs where they get to build and work in project. There's a lot of teamwork. There's a lot of things that are not hard engineering numerical, but about project planning, communication, and these things. Those things are very important when we hire young people. When we hire experienced people, is trying to understand, does the experience this person have? Can that experience transfer well to what we are doing in a different industry? And also, well, with senior people, I think there's a lot of people that are enamored with the word startup, with the word entrepreneurship. And I mean, it is romanticized quite a lot. So a lot of people think they want to work in a startup, but it's about telling them, hey, this is how it is in a startup. So being transparent, being vulnerable, that you're going to turn them off, right? But it is a self-selecting filter, because if they say, well, actually, I thought that's what I wanted, but now I know that I don't, yeah, it's a bummer, because then they turn you down. But the people that actually do come in, I think, are a better fit. The best is when people have already worked in a startup. I really like people that have worked in a startup and large companies. There's another trick that I learned as well, because it happened a couple of times. People that had worked at a startup that now are very senior and they think that they want to work in a startup again. But the problem is they worked at a startup when they were in their 20s, and now they're in their 40s, 50s. That usually doesn't work because they are not the same person. The startup is still a startup, it's still crazy, but they are no longer that same person. So they fell in love with how it was working a startup back when they were 20, but they don't realize that now they are a different person. Hiring people is difficult. I think is one of the values at the company is we build a machine that builds the machine. Some people think it is about we're designing the manufacturing to build the product. And I guess it is a little bit about that, but in reality, it's about building a culture and a company that helps us attract people, so that people can build the company, right? That builds the product that eventually makes us all successful and realizes the vision of self-driving.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, one of the things that Duncan mentioned was, there's I don't know if it's a strict policy or not, but no one is supposed to eat lunch at their desk. And you have kind of enforced having sort of communal lunches, which I think started off very early on in the business. That's just kind of one component of culture. But how do you sort of think about culture at Baraja, and how has that evolved, or sort of how do you sort of maintain that as the company continues to grow and scale over time?
Yeah, a lot of it changes and a lot of it stays the same. So I think the vehicle changes, but in many cases the spirit is the same. So we still try to okay, I'll give you an example. Back then we had one coffee machine, so everyone had coffee together, right? Now we could have, and actually we do have multiple coffee machines, but we've made sure that we put the really good coffee machine in one place so that everyone goes to that same kitchen, and there's a lot of talking and a lot of informal discussions. We have one big, back in the day, there was only one place where you could have lunch. Now there's multiple alternatives. So we've just adopted the policy of providing lunch to try to force people to have lunch together. And also, I tend to think that a lot of these things can be, if you focus on the spirit of it. I'll give you an example. Back then, we didn't have money to do group activities, but we were at an office which was next to the Lenco National Park. So we used to do bushwalks. So, hey, let's walk for an hour, get to the national park, throw frisbee, throw ball, sit on a circle, chat out. And we made a point of chatting. Hey, well, we're growing. How does it feel? What's scary? What do you like about how it used to be? What do you don't like about how it is today? And we still do a lot of these things. And it's not that we cannot afford other group activities, but nothing beats walking for, say, an hour in the bush. You're single file walking. There's a person in front, a person behind. You are going to be talking. And you could choose who you're walking next to, but sometimes it's very random. You start talking and talking and talking. And then when you throw a ball, you start chatting. These things these are examples of cultural things that have stayed with the company. It's a concerted effort, right? I mean, CB&I still, I guess, like them, and that's why we still promote them and try to do that. But there's a lot of things that evolve. Like now we have offices around the world, right? So in reality, you have to go the extra mile and try to make effort to bond and onboard and people all over the world, time zones and stuff. That is an area I'm still working through. I cannot tell you that we've nailed it. I'm learning about that. I hope that was a good example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess speaking of the evolution of the company as well, I think the business is at a really interesting stage. I think you've just touched on this a little bit earlier in terms of bringing senior people into the company. Like I know you've added, I think it's Craig Barrett onto the board, and I know you've made a number of key hires as well. What type of effect does having people like that have on the company and I guess the way that you continue to operate?
That's a good point. I'm super excited that we've brought in Craig Barrett as our first independent non-executive director. He brings a wealth of experience from being CEO of startups and also being executive at big companies like Intel, Google, et cetera. What is the effect? Well, the reason why we're doing it is because we're in a different growth of phase of the company where we are trying to evolve from a startup to growth phase and starting to evolve and mature the product roadmap and the offering, and also the level of seriousness of the partnerships and customers that we're dealing with require this kind of evolution. The effect into the company is, remember when I was telling you it's important that you are right, but also important that you're contrarian, that you're the only one right? Well, that goes just so far, right? If you are literally the only one in the world that believes it, then it's not much fun, right? Eventually, you need to start convincing other people. And that is a big validation of your hypothesis, right? To what, at that point, I guess it's a hypothesis. So the effect is one of validation as well as support. It turbocharges the company. And I'm talking not just about the Craig Barrett, the director, but we're hiring across the C-level suite, and we're getting some amazing heavy hitters. So they really turbocharge the growth, and they make a lot of things that are difficult for a startup founder a lot easier, in the sense that they bring big business and management experience. They bring operational excellence, things that I am not great at, maybe, or that I'm happy to say that they're better at than I am. So they are in a way mentors for me as well, for me and CV. I hope that they also see an opportunity to learn from CV and I, because I mean, we certainly have skills in other areas, but the effect is, I think, a very positive effect for me personally and for my co-founder, and I think also for the rest of the team. It's big validation, and it's a big push forward, because these people come ready to execute, right? So we also need to bring our A game.
It's amazing just the transformative effect of having the right people at the right time to help push not just them, but also everyone else in the team along as well. Speaking of that, in my conversation with Rick, it was really interesting to kind of hear from him, what were some of the points that kind of helped build conviction from a Blackbird perspective in investing in you early. Obviously you touched on this early in terms of their investment with Zoox. They knew what a big problem it was. Rick mentioned how much he sort of connected and loved you and Cibi as a founding team and what you were building. Obviously the tech infrastructure as well. But one of the other things that he mentioned that he, really sort of connected with and that built a lot of conviction with him was your willingness to go and speak to customers very early on in the journey as well. Can you share a little bit about what some of those early conversations were like in speaking to customers, even when you were at a very sort of prototype stage of the business, and how did that help shape how, the product has evolved over time?
Yeah, very, very early, not prototype, kind of proof of concept and PowerPoint stage. Yeah, he threw us into the ring. Look, I think it's something that I'm eternally grateful to the Blackbird team for. They did it in a way that added value to me as well. We pitched them, they understood the problem, they thought we had a neat solution, a different solution, and I guess we showed them the proof of concept, which was a benchtop experiment. But I mean, how are they gonna know, right? They said, hey, we think it's a good idea. How about we introduce you to a few people that are in a better position to judge than we are? So they introduced us to, I won't name names, but 3 of the, back then, and even today, the biggest names in self-driving around the world, the people that were intimately involved in developing self-driving cars, and that intimately knew, or especially knew, around the LiDAR problem for self-driving. So they made the introductions. We had to kind of tell these teams about our idea. And then on the back of it, these teams reported back to Blackbird saying, well, what they thought about the idea, right? And I don't know exactly what they said. It must have been something like, look, it looks very different, a bit crazy, but if they can do it, it sounds like an amazing idea. And on the back of that, Blackbird felt the confidence that we were onto something. For us, what it did is it introduced us to literally the people that became our first customers. Again, without naming names, last week, one of the guys that I got introduced to through Blackbird has now 5 years after, and actually this person was instrumental in getting us our first ever purchase order. He's now joined the company and he works for us. And it's such a small world in a way. So I guess this is extremely satisfying for me, right? One of those early believers continues to believe 5 years after. And it's been 5 years of difficulty because we've been solving really difficult problems. And there's many more ahead. But he's so excited because he knows we're solving the right problems, right? Instead of solving some problems that then you have to throw away and pivot to a different solution. Yeah, so that's been really rewarding for me.
So Fed, one of the things that really strikes me from some of the things that you've mentioned in terms of, how you approach the product and the technology that you're building, and also even the way that you do your sort of hiring process and onboarding of staff and really investing in them, it's really thinking about the long term. And I think as founders, sometimes it's really easy to get caught up in the minutiae of the day-to-day or kind of thinking very short-term. What are some systems or processes that you use or advice that you would have for founders to be able to kind of step back and really think long-term in what they're building to make the right strategic decisions?
Well, look, I guess let's start by saying not always, I guess, this is the right approach, right? In the industry we were going into, we really needed to look long-term. But I'm not sure if that is the right approach for everyone. There's a few things that you always need to look long-term, like people, right? The other one is, I guess, the investors that you choose are also very important. Look, it's not all, right? Because eventually you need money, and money for itself is a means and an end in itself. But I guess if you can find investors that you really like, and I think we are very lucky that I think we really like Blackbird, and then that pays off because they stay with you and you stay with them. And in terms of people, oh man, I don't know. If I had known, I would have hired people and culture, human resources function sooner. And then back then I thought HR is HR, but now I know that, it's learning and development and talent acquisition, culture. They're all actually very different functions and very different personalities. The talent acquisition is more like a hunter, more like a salesperson. The people and culture, learning and development is more maternal, nurturing, caring. So, I used to think that I should be able to hire one person that does everything, and that wasn't the case. And look, everyone told me, no, it's two people. And I was like, I've been doing it myself. And I still think we haven't got it fully right.
Well, maybe if I could sort of phrase this in a slightly different way, as a founder of a company that's, growing quickly, and, you've got a range of different resources or kind of problems that come up, how do you sort of understand or define what the right problem is to attack? So especially when you were kind of talking about, putting that self-imposed constraint on yourself into your growth, because you wanted to really focus on, not just hitting the wall where everyone else will do, but kind of really thinking beyond that. How do you, as a founder, when you've got so many different problems that are in place, decide what are things that are really important that you need to sort of over-index on versus things that you can?
Yeah, look, I think that I've been very close to a customer even now. In the early days, I would literally be the guy that travels with the product, does the installation, the troubleshooting. But even very late now, I still join a lot of the customer calls, and sometimes I'm the person that has to explain the problems and make sure that we solve them. So, it is I would sometimes kill to have someone that faces the customer with an apology, because not everything goes right? But by forcing myself, or maybe by not having someone else, the fact that I am there experiencing the pain that the customer has had to experience because of maybe a problem with my product, that teaches you something very valuable, right? And then you have to make amends, and you have to make a promise, and you have to give your word that you're going to fix it. And then, well, that again is your word is your bond, and then you have to translate that here. So I think that really centers you in terms of what is really important. On the other hand, I'm lucky that I still have a very good handle on the technology and the engineering, so I can be quick on my feet on to what extent promise and manage expectations to not over-promise. So I guess, I imagine a lot of the founders would also be deeply involved with the product and with the customers. And I guess the important thing I see is not to give that away too early. There is a point, though, where you start talking to different levels of people at the customer, right? So I guess I talk less and less now with the engineering teams and more with the executive teams, but still having to talk to the customer is very, very important in understanding what's priority number one.
Fantastic. And we mentioned this right at the start, but congratulations on your recent fundraise as well, $40 million. What's next for Baraja?
Well, as I said, I think this year is going to be a very exciting year. I think that on the macro, the self-driving technology is coming to a maturity point where we're going to start seeing more and more self-driving cars becoming a reality, a commercial reality, rather than just an R&D reality. I think this is one of the years where that starts happening solidly. And what that means for us is it becomes a lot more real in terms of delivery to customers. Some of these customers are going to start growing with our solutions and our technology. So that's extremely rewarding. But the reason why we were fundraising, we've closed this round, is because we are starting to invest and doubling down on the investment for the second and third generations of the product. So we're making investments today to have technology in 3, 5, and 10 years' time that allows us to remain ahead of the curve in terms of a product that is still extremely high performance, but gets smaller and smaller so it can be fully and seamlessly integrated into the aesthetics of the vehicle. But it's cheaper and cheaper, and it's more integrated so it can be manufactured at larger and larger scales. We have to be investing today in those technologies that will make the product in 3, 5, and 10 years' time. I think that it feels really, really good. You know, we started 5 years ago, and we've been working on getting this generation 1 of the technology out, and it feels reinvigorating to now double down on the investment for generation 2 and generation 3 of the technology. I guess the engineer, the inventor in me and in a lot of us gets really excited about starting. It's almost like starting a new company, right? Yeah, it's really interesting.
Fantastic. On that note, Fed, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for sharing your experience and insights. For anyone that wants to say hello, get in touch, find out more, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, look, we have lots of vacancies on our website. As I said, we're hiring massively across all disciplines, not only technical, but commercial, people, marketing. So do drop a line. I'm on LinkedIn. You can drop me a line there. I'm happy to touch base, happy to give advice, happy to have a coffee, happy to hear if you have any good ideas. Yeah, I think those are the best 2 ways.
Fantastic. I will make sure all of those links are in the show notes. Fed, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Rohit, pleasure talking to you. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks for listening to episode 146 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.